I don't know how many of you have watched TV recently, but I have noticed Save the Children on there quite a bit. So I'm hoping that we'll learn a little bit about that in the process. But it certainly focused me on the program today. So our speaker, Jenny Russell, leads Save the Children's public policy and advocacy efforts on issues related to democracy, human rights, and governance, including foreign aid effectiveness, localization, civil society participation, and global tax and development. Ms. Russell has over 25 years of experience in political advocacy, coalition building, and evaluation of issues, campaigns for development, and humanitarian organizations. Most recently, she served as the advocacy director of the Enough Project at the Center for American Progress. Previously, Ms. Russell launched Habitat for Humanity's first advocacy campaign, and worked with Catholic Relief Services to develop advocacy strategies and trainings. Ms. Russell also led an evaluation of CARE's advocacy in Sudan and Afghanistan over 10 years, among other positions. She has overseas work experience in Sudan, Venezuela, Haiti, Swaziland, and Central America. Ms. Russell holds a master's in international affairs from Columbia University. And if that isn't an introduction by itself, I don't know what is. So Jenny, could you please come forward?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, Jack. And really, I'm feeling very blessed and honored that all of you invited me back. I came maybe 7 years ago and talked about the Sustainable Development Goals, and I'm really happy to be back. And thank you, Olivia, my daughter, for doing my clicker here. I do want to thank my family for coming, Andy and Olivia, Jackson, Layla, my dad and Peggy, so thanks very much for your support. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the global food crisis. And as all of you know, I work for Save the Children. I've been there for about 10 years. And I had a special request that I focus on this issue today. It's not the issue actually that I lead at Save the Children, but it is a very important issue to the organization. And just to give you a little bit of background, if you don't know, Save the Children is a century-old organization. We just celebrated 100 years a few years ago. We work in 120 countries, and we also work in the United States. We work in particularly rural communities of the United States. We work on health issues, nutrition, food, emergency response, women's equality, children's rights, all sorts of different issues. I'm sure there's many more than that, but in general, we work to advance children's rights and well-being, and we focus on children under 18 and their families. And we're a multi-issue organization. We work in the developing world, both on development issues as well as humanitarian issues. So today we're going to look a little bit go kind of into some detail about the global food crisis, and look at kind of the nature of the problem, look at the drivers of the problem, and what Save the Children is doing about it. And obviously this is a very narrow view into a very complex and difficult, challenging issue, I think, that the whole world is trying to respond to right now. So really my goal for you for this presentation is just to inspire you all to learn a little bit more about the issue. So Olivia, you want to go for? Okay, so my presentation is divided into two parts. I'm going to start, and I have, just so you know, I have about 16 slides. I'll try to go through them fairly quickly. The first part of my presentation is focused on what's happening in countries. What is the food crisis in country look like, And then the second part of my presentation is what we're doing about it in Washington, D.C. in particular. Next slide. Okay, so looking at some of the, the evidence out there and the expertise of people who really study this issue. We rely a lot on UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, and their State of Food Security and Nutrition reports. And what is unique about this particular global food crisis is there's several things. One is our world is becoming more urban. People are moving from rural areas to urban areas. We also had a major pandemic. We are in the middle of some major geopolitical conflicts, particularly Ukraine, and climate change. And over time, particularly in Africa and Asia, these countries have been increasingly more dependent on national as well as global food markets. So these are some of the issues that are a little bit different and make the food crisis, I think, unique at this moment. Go ahead. So these are a lot of numbers, but I think the important thing is that the need is greater and the resources are harder to secure. So in terms of the need, over 3 years, acute food insecurity has more than doubled. In terms of the people facing food insecurity, and that is a person's inability to consume adequate food. And this endangers livelihoods, and 45 million people are currently facing starvation. That's across 37 countries. And then in terms of the resources, it's estimated that $51.5 billion are needed to help vulnerable people in 69 countries. This is numbers from the World Food Program. It's another kind of expert agency that we work closely with on the ground to help respond to the food crisis. Go ahead. This is a slide. It's a little hard to see, I know, but I thought it would be interesting for you to look at. So when we are interacting with communities, the question is, how do you classify food insecurity? And the consistent inavailability of food. And this is a 5-point scale that we use across countries. And going from left to right, the first is none. Families are able to meet their basic food needs. The second is, stressed. Families have minimal adequate consumption. Then moving into this, the humanitarian food assistance is urgently needed. These 3 categories of crisis, emergency, and catastrophe. This is an important chart when we look at the next slide. So pay attention to the colors here. Go to the next slide. So this is Africa. If you remember, yellow is generally stressed. So if you look at Niger and Chad and Mali, and these are countries in what they call the Sahel region, and you may have heard that Niger had a recent coup. These are extremely vulnerable countries, particularly geopolitically, with dictators, countries that are flipping from democratically elected to dictatorships. And you can see that those countries are at risk of a food crisis. Currently, the countries that are definitely in the middle of a food crisis are Sudan, Central African Republic, and it's not labeled here, but right to the right of Uganda is Kenya, which is in red, and that's emergency. Households have large food consumption gaps, are engaged in negative coping mechanisms in order to address those gaps. Next one. So as you can imagine, the food crisis is bigger than just a food crisis. It has a lot of different dimensions. It's a health crisis, a mental health crisis, an education crisis. And as I was saying, in order to adapt to their situation, people have what you would say negative coping strategies. They're cutting back on meals, they're changing their diets, they're pulling kids out of school in order to work. They're marrying off their daughters into child marriage situations in order to receive money, but also to release one of their children to somebody else so they don't have to feed them. They're selling off some productive assets and they're leaving home, meaning they're migrating. There could be migrating from rural areas to urban areas or migrating out of countries to safer countries. So it's a very complex situation, and everybody is trying to figure out how they can cope with that crisis. So as folks can imagine, and the reason why Save the Children is so engaged in this response is because children are most affected by this crisis. And one thing Save the Children does is we write reports, we go into countries and we interview people. And in this case, a couple years ago, we interviewed some folks in 32 different countries, from Afghanistan to Somalia, on how hunger is impacting their lives. And we took from that some recommendations, which we advocate on in Washington, D.C. But these are some words spoken by children that I felt were particularly poignant. And I think it's a really important approach that Save the Children takes to listen to children, listen to what they say about how they are personally impacted by the crisis. So this is a fairly busy and complex slide, but it just gives you a sense that we both respond to the saving lives aspect in the short term, but in the long term, improving resilience, ensuring that people can improve their livelihoods. So in the short term, it's these 5 things: protecting families' ability to access their basic items, supporting livelihoods, maintaining essential health, keeping children safe, and keeping children learning, keeping them in school as much as possible. And in addition to that, we advocate with the U.S. government and other donors. I would say donors meaning the World Bank, the multilateral development institutions, to scale up humanitarian funding, committing to long-term measures, delivering on international agreements. These are the type of things we both do programmatically as well as in advocacy with the government. So turning to what we are doing in Washington, D.C. To address this crisis. So one thing we are doing is we're educating Congress. So Congress has the power of the purse. They determine how much funding goes to programs both domestically and internationally. And we are in a lot of our time and effort is spent educating members of Congress on the problem, bringing in experts, bringing in people from countries to present about what they are experiencing, how the food crisis is affecting them personally, and then we advocate for certain pieces of legislation, or even the budget appropriations process to try to generate more funding from the U.S. government that can go to the countries that are impacted by the crisis. So this is an example of an event that we did, it looks like April 22nd, where we brought in Save the Children staff from East and Southern Africa, Action Against Hunger, which is another organization. We brought in the U.S. Agency for International Development, Humanitarian Assistance Bureau from Africa, and so sometimes we bring in people from the executive branch, from the, in this case, the Biden administration, because sometimes, believe it or not, Congress doesn't hear from them very often directly. And then also, we bring in some local experts, and this was specifically an event which was looking at, how the conflict in Ukraine has impacted hunger. So another thing that we do is we take members of Congress to countries around the world. And we just did this last April. We took 6 members of Congress to Kenya. And you can't see it on this slide, but there were about 5 different areas in this area of Kenya where we took them and helped them to see for themselves what the crisis was about, and linked them with communities, really, to talk to communities about how those people were being impacted. So it does make a big difference. Members of Congress, just like anyone, they will understand it if they see it and hear from people themselves. So it makes a big difference to connect politicians with the problem in the communities. And then another thing we do is we issue public statements. This is a statement on the Ukrainian supplemental. So we sent this statement out saying we agree with the supplemental, the extra budget amount going to Ukraine, but in addition to that, we asked for $5 billion more for emergency global food security funding. So this is a way in which our Congress can fund things outside of the normal appropriations processes, creating these supplemental requests, which have been funding a lot of the response to the Ukraine crisis. But the problem is, if you only think about Ukraine and not the consequences of the crisis on other countries, it's not seeing the full picture. So we were trying to provide that with this particular statement. And then the other thing we do is we have a lot of grassroots supporters in the US that support Save the Children, and we invite them to send notes to their legislators. And this is an example of a note that we were trying to both educate our grassroots about the problem of the world's food supply, but also, get those messages to members of Congress. And this is the last slide I have in terms of the work that we're doing in Washington, D.C. It's just one example. We are involved in advocacy related to the Farm Bill. Folks may know every 5 years the Farm Bill is reauthorized, and it funds both support to farmers in the U.S., but it also funds emergency funding globally. And one thing we are doing is trying to point out to Congress that we need food commodities, but we also need flexibility. So for example, right now there's a whole debate in Congress of legislators that are saying we can send food overseas, but it has to be rice and corn and commodities that are surplus from U.S. farmers. And those surplus foods have to be shipped on U.S. flagged vessels. And part of our advocacy is saying, well, that's inefficient. Not enough of the funding will actually go to people in need. And so we are trying to raise this issue with members of Congress that we can't have those requirements. We need to be able to have funding that is more flexible, that we can actually use cash to invest in the local agricultural markets, and that we can decide with communities on the type of assistance that they need. It could be U.S. sourced food, it could be corn and wheat, or it could be something else. But it could be educational programs for smallholder farmers, it could be village savings groups. So this is the type of advocacy that we do, is trying to broaden the picture, I think, for members of Congress to understand that these types of bills are important for, to confront the food crisis, but there's a little bit more nuance and flexibility that's needed for that funding to be effective. So I would say, in terms of the overarching principles that we have, and this can be applied to all the work that Save the Children does, and probably most of the work that you all do, listen to the people most affected, providing as flexible assistance as possible according to the needs that they communicate. Look for gaps and vulnerabilities and focus on those groups. Children are particularly vulnerable, as I mentioned, in the global food crisis, so are women. There's enormous gender gaps in terms of who can access food. There's also gaps of individuals of certain religions and discrimination that we all need to look for, and to ensure that every person has access to the food assistance. And number 4, I think, is really important, strengthening the local civil society and the government in that country's capacity to deliver assistance. Ultimately, Save the Children would like to work ourselves out of a job. We would like there to be a world someday where, we don't need to exist. And we can do that if we have our eye on the prize of strengthening some of these local organizations that are working alongside us, and the government's ability to address the needs of their own people. So that's it. Thank you very much. Yes.
Do you have any arms in your program to
Microphone.
Oh, do you need this?
birth control?
Birth control. Okay, can you say your question again?
Do you have any parts of your program that facilitate birth control?
Yes, I think I am not personally involved, but we do sexual and reproductive rights work, educating people about the importance of having the size families that they desire, being able to control the size of their families. We see that as a woman's right and a family's right to do that. So we do provide some education on that. We do not provide any abortion services, though. Yep.
Well, I'm curious about organization. I know we hear all the time that that starvation is not a supply problem, it's a distribution problem.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that work for your organization? Like the last mile, getting the food to the mouths?
That's a great question, and I don't know if I can answer it. I will venture to guess from some experience that I have that, issue of supply chain is really critical. This is one reason why, as I mentioned, we would much prefer to, rather than take bags of corn and wheat that's, on US flagged vessels into the country, we'd rather use the cash and buy in the local agricultural markets. That, I think, helps to generally strengthen the community's ability and resilience to ultimately keep agricultural production in their local communities. And so I think that I don't know if that answers it, but okay. Yep.
Global warming is making it much more difficult, especially in the desert areas in Africa. And the availability of water is directly related to the availability of food. Do you guys have a position on global warming, and what are you doing about water shortages?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, we align with the scientists that believe global warming is real and global climate change is real, and are very concerned about water and drought conditions, which is, as I mentioned, the crisis has been exacerbated by climate change, but the way in which that looks in Kenya or in sub-Saharan Africa is the lack of rain. And so water supplies are really concerning, and I don't know if you noticed, but that first slide that I showed, it's just so barren. It's just such a barren, and that's why it makes such a big difference to bring members of Congress, because they realize, these are the conditions where people are living. And water is really a big concern, and I wouldn't be able to go into detail about how we're addressing that, but a lot of attention to, and part of our gender equality work is ensuring that people have access to water closer into their communities, that people don't have to, women in particular have to spend hours fetching water. So, well production in the community is important. But that groundwater is being reduced and over time, so it's a big problem. Thank you.
Don't leave yet, Jenny. Jenny, thank you so much for being with us, and we have a gift for you. Come back. It's entirely appropriate that we give you food. This is a box of citrus, locally grown, from our club to you, from Friends Ranch. Thank you so much. How about a round of applause? A couple of quotes for the day. Food brings people together on so many different levels.